Welcome back to Chapter 7 of the Complete iOS Developer course. Let's take a moment to see just how much you've covered. You may well have learned how to install and download OS X on a Windows PC. That's not an easy task in itself. But you've definitely installed Xcode, learned about buttons, text inputs, you've run a little bit of code, and you've built a quick cat ears app. Then we played quite a lot in the Swift playground and learned about variables, arrays, dictionaries, if statements, made a couple of games, and an app which worked out whether a number was prime or not. Then we started getting a little more deeply into Xcode itself and looked at navigation bars. We made a stopwatch app working with time. We looked at populating tables and persistent storage. We learned about S-segues and controlling the keyboard. We made a to-do list app and a What's the Weather app which actually downloaded live content from the web. Then in section 6, you worked with images, doing some animating and moving things around. You made a tic-tac-toe game. That was one of my particular favorites. You worked with maps and made a couple of apps with maps involving Where Am I and the Memorable Places app, which again was something I really enjoyed. And then you did a bit of work with audio, making the back app, and then the swiping and shaking and the sound shaker app. So that's a huge amount that you've covered already. But we're only just halfway through the course, so there's a lot more to learn. And in this chapter, we're going to focus on an often feared aspect of Xcode, which is core data. Essentially, what core data is a database storage for your app. We've used NSUserDefaults to store data permanently so far, which is fine as far as it goes, but when you start having a lot of data, like say an email application or anything which has a large amount of data for the user, that gets very unwieldy and you keep having to convert it back and forward and saving it and all of that. So this aims to get over that. There is a bit of a hurdle when actually setting up core data to start with. It takes a little while to get used to, but that's exactly what we're going to do in this video, and I'll lead you through it, and we'll have it done in 10 to 15 minutes. So let's go for our usual single view application, and we're going to tick a box we've never ticked before, the Use Core Data box. And we'll just call this Core Data Demo. Everything else can stay the same. So the using core data will allow us to have a few new functions in our app delegate, which we'll just have a quick look at. We don't have to worry about too much what these functions are, but this is the different bit here. So here we go. We've got persistent store coordinator, manage object context, save context, etc., etc. So these are the bits of code which manage the core data aspect for us. You may have noticed as well, we've got a new bit here. This is our data model. So this is where we're going to create our databases and our database structure that we'll use in the app itself. So we'll come to those a little bit later on. But for now, let's see what code we need to add core data to our app. So first, we need to import the core data framework. You can see it's been imported in the app delegate, but we're not necessarily going to want to use it in every view controller. So we do have to put that in manually. So now we can use core data in our main view controller. And just before we write any code, let's go over to our data model and just decide what we want our data to look like here. We can really put in anything. It doesn't matter. But I'm going to start with adding an attribute. And I'm going to add a username. And this is going to have a type of string. And then I'm going to add another one, password, which is also a string. So attributes are essentially just different variables that we have in the database, and we can store as many of these different usernames and passwords as we like. Relationships and fetched properties we'll look at later on. We'll just stick with attributes for now. Okay, so now we've created our data structure. Let's get back over to View Controller. Now these bits of code are a little bit complicated. I'm going to explain them as best I can, but don't worry about them too much. Essentially they're setup lines of code that allow us to access the core data. So first we're going to create a variable called appdel, which is going to have a type of app delegate. So we're essentially setting up an app delegate to deal with our core data. And that's going to be equal to UI application dot shared application dot delegate, and we need to just specify as app delegate. Okay, so now we can refer to the app delegate using our appdel variable. We create a variable called context. It's going to have a type of NS managed object context, and that's simply appdel dot managed object context. So this context essentially gives us a framework within which we can access our core data database. And sorry, we do need to force unwrap that, so we need an exclamation mark on the end. Okay, so those two lines are somewhat mysterious. Essentially, they're setting up the context for us to be able to work with the database. From here on, it gets a lot more straightforward. So let's create a new user, which I want to add to the database. And we use the function NSEntityDescription, and we want to insert new object for entity for name. So essentially this is inserting a new item into the database. Now here we need to put our entity name. You may not have noticed that actually. In fact, I forgot to change it. So here when I added an entity, it's just called it entity. So entity is a table essentially. If you're familiar with databases, an entity is a table that contains various bits of information. So I'm just going to call this my users table or my users entity. Then we'll switch back over here. So my entity name is users. And my context is context. So the context that we created up there. Now you can see we've got a warning there. The warning is that the variable new user is inferred to have a type any object. Now we met objects when we were dealing with NSUser defaults. Often we can't do a lot of things with those. So the advice from Xcode is to add an explicit type, which is indeed what we're going to do. We're going to call this NS managed object. So that will enable us to work with this particular variable and insert some data into our user's entity or table. So let's give it some data to work with. New user dot set value, and we'll set Rob for name. I'm just going to check. I think I put username. Obviously, pretty important you get these right. So username, but all small. And then, because I have awful passwords, we'll set pass for password. And then it's just a matter of saving it to the data, which we do using context.save. And here we've got an error there. I'm just going to be lazy for now and put context.save nil. So that means we're not going to do anything with this error. If we get an error, we don't care. Nothing will happen. Obviously, it's better practice to at least print the error to the console or do something with it. But for now, this will do. And that's it. So we've now created our context, which allows us to work with the data in the database. And this then should very simply save the data rob and pass into the data structure here that we've got. Unfortunately, we're not quite in a position to run our app yet, because if we do, it will save these bits of data to the database, but it won't actually do anything that we can check, because we can't, unfortunately, go in here and have a look at the contents of the database. We can only look at the data structure here. So before we can actually run our app and return some data, we need to bring back this bit of information from the database. So let me show you how to do that. So we create a variable called request, which is an NS fetch request, which just fetches data from the database. And we're going to fetch it from the users. entity or the user's table. We need to add one option for this request, and that is return objects as false has to be false. This seems to be an issue with this version of the Xcode beta. Whether or not you need it in your code, just try it out and see if you do. You may well not, but in the beta 4, which I'm using, I do need this to correctly return the data. So now we're going to create a results array, which is going to store the results of this fetch request. And we use context.execute fetch request. The request that we want to execute is request. No, thank you. And we're not going to worry about errors for now, so we'll just put nil as our error pointer. Okay, and now we can just print results to the console, and finally we should be able to see the results of our good work, and we should get Rob and pass returned from the database. And there we go. Fantastic. Right there, let's just bring it up. So we've got various bits of information. We may have more than one, because I think I've run this a few times just to test it and make sure it's working. But you can see we're getting the data back from the database, which is good. Just to convince ourselves that this is indeed permanent, let's just run it again without these lines. And we should get exactly the same results, because this core data is permanent storage, so it's stored in the app, so you don't need to add it each time. Let's just make sure that that's behaving as it should. There we go. There's our results, exactly as before. Fantastic. Now, one last thing that I'm going to do before ending this video is just show you how to process these results, because obviously in this format, they're not particularly useful. They're inside all sorts of, as we've seen, NSManage objects, and there's all sorts of bits of metadata that we don't need. We just really, most of the time, want to get to pass and Rob. So how do we do that? Well, essentially, we just loop through the results array here. So hopefully you remember this code. We can do for result, and our result is going to be an any object in results. So we're just looping through the results array, and for now we'll just print that to the console. So result. So let's just get rid of this line. Now, good practice here is to have an if statement around your for loop, which just tests for there being any results. We know for certain that there are going to be 3, or at least in my app there are, because I've got them all, I've just seen them all, but we don't want to be doing this if the result is empty. So to test for that, all we need to do is if results.count, oh, once again, we're not JavaScript here, is greater than 0, then do this for loop. Oh, I've lost my indenting a bit there. And if not, then we could say something like no results. So that's an elegant way of dealing with the possibility that your database might be empty, or at least that your fetch request doesn't return any data. And there we go. You can see that separated out the 3 objects there, so we can work with each of them individually. If you want to access the password or the username directly, then all you need to do is say result dot, let's say password, or indeed result.username to get the username. And that will return it in a nice format, in this case a string. So now we get pass, pass, pass for those 3 entries in the database. So that's a brief introduction to how you use core data. In the next video, we're going to look at this in a bit more detail and do some more advanced entering data and also more advanced extracting data from tables.